Winter pressed against Ravenshire Palace like a silent accusation, its winds gliding over stone walls that had witnessed centuries of triumph and cruelty. Eleanor Whitmore moved through the corridor with the grace of a woman trained to hide her wounds, her pale blue gown whispering over the marble. Servants bowed with polished politeness, yet their eyes slid away, as though her very presence carried misfortune. Behind her, the murmurs followed, thin, poisonous threads weaving through the tapestry of the court. "The Duchess cannot conceive." Someone breathed from behind a fan, a tone pretending pity, but gleaming with satisfaction. Eleanor did not turn. She had learned that dignity was her final armor. Still, each whisper landed like ice upon her spine. In these halls, a woman's worth was measured not by compassion or intellect, but by her ability to cradle an heir. Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Ravenshire, awaited her in the council chamber, standing by the tall windows where daylight broke against his shoulders. He was a man shaped by duty, handsome in the solemn way of men forced to choose kingdom before heart. When he turned toward her, the struggle in his eyes struck deeper than any spoken judgment. The royal physician, Dr. Hartwell, cleared his throat, his powdered wig trembling slightly. "Your Graces, the examination confirms it." Eleanor braced herself, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her gloves. "The Duchess is barren." The words fell with the force of a blow. Eleanor felt the room tilt, though she kept her chin lifted, refusing to grant the court the satisfaction of watching her break. Alexander inhaled sharply, a sound so small it could have been missed, yet it felt to her louder than thunder. His gaze flickered, pain, disbelief, then the quiet submission of a man cornered by expectation. Later that afternoon, the monarchy's advisers assembled, their faces carved from ambition. They spoke of lineage, alliances, and duty as though discussing grain shipments rather than two living hearts. Eleanor stood beside Alexander, their shoulders almost touching yet separated by the chasm that formed with every cold word spoken. "An heir is not optional," Lord Suffolk declared. "The future of Ravenshire depends upon decisive action." Alexander's silence was a sentence. Eleanor felt it more keenly than the adviser's barbed remarks. He did not look at her, perhaps fearing that her eyes would reveal the depth of her anguish, or his. In that moment, she understood the tragic truth. Love, however sincere, was no match for a throne's hunger. The divorce was arranged with ruthless efficiency. Documents were inked, sealed, and carried through corridors as though dealing with state secrets rather than the unmaking of a marriage. Eleanor signed with steady fingers, though her heart trembled with every stroke. Alexander hovered near the fireplace, the glow sharpening the sorrow etched along his jaw. He stepped forward once, as though to speak, but the words collapsed before reaching air. She wished he would fight. Fight the advisers, the crown, the cruel diagnosis. Fight for her. But he only murmured, "Forgive me," his voice a wounded whisper. Eleanor bowed her head, though her throat burned. "May your lineage be fulfilled, Your Grace." The formality between them cut deeper than any blade. At dawn, the palace staff gathered to watch her departure, though none dared step forward. The sky was a pale wash of rose and silver, the world holding its breath as her carriage awaited. Eleanor paused at the grand entrance, feeling the chill seep through her cloak as memories clung to every stone arch. She looked back only once, catching the faint silhouette of Alexander at an upper window. His hand rested against the glass, fingers splayed as though reaching through the distance he himself had created. A footman stepped forward with hesitant compassion. "God keep you, my lady." She managed a soft smile, a gesture more for his kindness than her own comfort. Then she climbed into the carriage, the door closing with a finality that echoed like a tolling bell. As the horses began their slow descent down the palace drive, snowflakes drifted from the muted sky, settling on the glass like fragile blessings. Eleanor pressed a hand to her abdomen, a gesture instinctive and barely noticeable beneath her cloak. A faint ache pulsed there, one she had felt for weeks, dismissing it as sorrow's residue. But as the carriage carried her farther from the life she once tended like a garden, something within her whispered a different truth. It was not hope, not yet, but a tremor of possibility, a sensation she dared not name. She closed her eyes, feeling the rhythmic sway of the carriage cradle her in a gentler embrace than any she had known in months. The future loomed uncertain, a horizon veiled in snow, but her heart, though bruised, had not surrendered. The palace disappeared behind winter's veil, its towering spires swallowed by distance, but the echo of Alexander's final look lingered like a fragile ember. Eleanor knew the world would soon forget her name, for courts remembered only usefulness, not loyalty. Yet as the countryside unfurled beyond the carriage window, she felt the faintest stirring of defiance, a quiet vow forming beneath her ribs. She had been cast aside as barren, a judgment delivered by men who valued certainty over truth, but something deep within her whispered that her story was not yet finished. The ache in her abdomen deepened, warm rather than cruel, and she drew a slow breath, steadying herself against the unknown. When she opened her eyes, a tear traced her cheek, born not of sorrow, but of something fragile and rising hope. The countryside greeted Eleanor with a gentleness that felt foreign after the cold discipline of Ravenshire Palace. Fields rolled in softened gold beneath a sky rinsed clean by winter rain, and the quiet village of Welford Hollow welcomed her without question or curiosity. Her aunt, Margaret Whitmore, a woman of calm wisdom and steady eyes, opened her cottage door and drew Eleanor into an embrace that dissolved the last of her formal restraint. Here, she allowed herself to breathe, to sleep without dread, and to walk along muddy lanes with no one whispering about her failure to give England an heir. In those first quiet weeks, Eleanor found herself studying the small rhythms of village life, tracing comfort in ordinary sounds. The creak of timber carts, the chatter of laundresses by the river, the soft clucking of hens beneath her aunt's kitchen window. Each sound reminded her she was no longer a duchess pressed beneath the weight of expectation, but simply a woman recovering from a wound no one could see. Yet solitude carried its own sharp edge. In the privacy of night, grief unraveled her composure, returning her to the moment Alexander released her hand forever into the waiting silence. One crisp morning, a traveling physician arrived in Welford Hollow, his carriage modest but his demeanor scholarly and assured. Dr. Alistair Graham introduced himself, with a warm Scottish cadence that eased even Eleanor's guarded heart. He offered free examinations to villagers unable to afford formal care, and Aunt Margaret insisted Eleanor allow him a routine evaluation. Reluctant yet polite, she agreed, expecting nothing more than the usual polite condolences. But Dr. Graham studied her pallor, her pulse, the subtle tension beneath her ribs, and something in his expression shifted from professional neutrality to thoughtful concern that would alter her fate. When he returned the following afternoon, Eleanor sensed the gravity in his silence. He invited her to sit near the hearth, where firelight softened the room's humble edges. With gentle precision, he explained that the diagnosis she had received was not only questionable, but likely incorrect. Eleanor felt her breath falter, her hands trembling as possibility warred with disbelief. Dr. Graham spoke of rare conditions, misread symptoms, and the dangers of hurried conclusions made under courtly pressure. By the time he finished, her world, once constrained by sorrow, began to widen, trembling on the threshold of unimaginable revelation waiting just beyond fear. Days passed in a haze of cautious hope. Eleanor found herself listening intently to her body, noticing faint stirrings she had long dismissed as exhaustion. Dr. Graham visited twice more, each time noting subtle changes that deepened his conviction. When the morning finally came that he confirmed her pregnancy, Eleanor sat utterly still, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The physician spoke kindly, reminding her that the court might resist such news, but she hardly heard him. The impossible had become real within her. She whispered a prayer of gratitude, feeling life flutter like a fragile promise beneath her ribs. Word traveled swiftly, borne by a baroness who recognized Eleanor during a market visit and wasted no time carrying the tale back to London. Within days, whispers wove through drawing rooms and parlors. The dismissed duchess, once declared barren, now carried a child. Some called it scandal, others divine irony, but all agreed it would shake the foundations of Ravenshire. In the palace, Alexander heard the rumor from an adviser who watched him closely, searching for cracks in his composure. The Duke dismissed the report with practiced restraint, Yet a flicker of uncertainty betrayed the truth he dared not voice. Eleanor received the royal invitation on an evening washed in candlelight, its elegant script unmistakably bearing the seal of Raven's heir. Her aunt read it twice, disbelief widening her eyes before caution tightened her expression. "You need not go," Margaret murmured, but Eleanor already felt a stirring resolution taking shape. She had lived in shadow long enough. Truth deserved light, even if that light burned. She pressed the invitation to her chest, sensing that her return would not simply challenge the narrative that ruined her, but reclaim the dignity stolen from her without mercy and restore what silence had broken forever. The journey back to Raven's heir unfolded beneath a sky pale as frosted glass. Eleanor wore a gown of deep winter green, chosen not for grandeur but for the quiet strength it suggested. As her carriage approached the palace gates, memories rushed in. Each archway, each lantern, each echoing footstep imprinted upon her like an old bruise. Yet she did not falter. Servants murmured in astonishment as she stepped out, her rounded form visible beneath her cloak. Their eyes widened, not with cruelty, but with awe. Eleanor drew a steady breath, feeling the earth shift beneath her returning footsteps to its threshold. Inside the vast entrance hall, light cascaded from crystal chandeliers, scattering brilliance across polished floors that once echoed with her laughter. Now the space felt foreign, reverent, almost expectant. Every conversation ceased as she moved forward, her presence altering the air like a long-forgotten melody restored. She kept her gaze steady, though her heart thudded with a mingling of fear and resolve. Somewhere beyond these walls, Alexander walked unaware that truth had come home. Eleanor sensed the moment tightening around her, a hush gathering as though the palace itself prepared for reckoning long delayed, yet impossible to escape at last. From the arched doorway to the ballroom, music drifted in soft, trembling waves, each note carrying the memory of nights she once believed would define her life. Eleanor paused at the threshold, her breath catching as she gathered every fragment of courage she had forged in exile. She stepped forward, the light unfolding around her like an awakening. Conversations dissolved into stunned silence. And then she saw him. Alexander stood across the room, his profile carved in shadow and candlelight. When he turned, his eyes found her instantly, then dropped, widened, and froze upon the unmistakable curve of her child within. Morning light pooled across the estate's eastern corridor, softening the edges of everything it touched, yet nothing could soften the tension threading the air as Eleanor Harwood stepped through the arched doorway. She carried herself with practiced composure, but beneath her calm exterior lingered the ache of a woman forced to walk on ground that no longer felt like her own. The distant murmur of servants, the faint perfume of polished wood, the rhythmic tick of the manor clock, all of it pressed around her as she approached the drawing room, knowing she would not be entering alone today. Waiting inside, Lord Alastair Ravenscourt stood near the tall windows, his posture deceptively relaxed. The early sun carved a gold outline around him, giving the impression of nobility untouched by doubt, yet his eyes betrayed a turbulence he no longer tried to conceal. He turned at the sound of Eleanor's footsteps, and for a fleeting moment something familiar flickered between them, something that once promised safety. But the memory evaporated quickly, replaced by the reminder of why she had been summoned, and why he looked as though he had spent the night wrestling ghosts neither of them wished to name. Eleanor did not speak first. She feared her voice might break the fragile stillness balancing between them. Instead, she moved further into the room, careful, deliberate, as though each step acknowledged the weight of their shared past. Alastair's gaze followed her, not demanding, but pleading in ways he wouldn't allow his lips to express. A year ago, she might have crossed the room with unguarded affection. A year ago, betrayal had not yet carved its cold mark across her chest. Now every breath she took held the echo of that wound, shaping the distance she refused to surrender. Alastair cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the hush. "Thank you for coming," he said, though both knew she had not been given much choice. His fingers tightened around the edge of the windowsill, whitening at the knuckles as though steadying himself against some invisible storm. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in recognition. She had once known the man behind that restless gesture. He was afraid of consequences, of truths, of what the day might demand. And fear, she realized, had a way of exposing sincerity even when words refused to cooperate. At last, he faced her fully. "There is something you must hear," he began, voice low, almost reverent. Eleanor braced herself, expecting another attempt at apology, another plea she could not accept. But instead he stepped aside, revealing a sealed envelope resting on the small table behind him. Its wax bore the crest of a family neither of them had spoken of in months. Her heartbeat stumbled. That crest belonged to the woman at the center of their undoing, the one whose whispered accusations had shattered vows and driven Eleanor from the very walls that once promised sanctuary. "Why now?" Eleanor asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Alistair didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to the letter, as though touching it might burn him. "Because," he said finally, "the truth inside it changes everything we thought we understood." His admission carved a tremor through her resolve. For months she had carried the certainty that his betrayal had been deliberate, that trust once broken could never be restored. Yet something in his expression, raw, unguarded, suggested a shift beneath the surface, an unraveling of lies she had never been given the chance to confront directly. She reached for the envelope, but stopped short, fingertips hovering just above it. The moment felt fragile, as though touching the letter might cause the entire room to fracture. Alistair watched her with a mixture of hope and dread, neither emotion fully winning. Eleanor exhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch between them like a taut thread. Her memories fought to reclaim her, nights of cold disbelief, days of wandering without destination, the sting of knowing the man she loved had believed another over her. Yet the presence of the letter hinted at something deeper, something dangerously capable of rewriting the past. At last she broke the stalemate. With careful precision, she lifted the envelope and cracked the seal. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Inside lay a single sheet of parchment, its ink hurried, its edges wrinkled as though written in desperation. Eleanor read silently, her eyes narrowing, widening, then narrowing again. Each sentence struck like a blow. Confessions of lies told, envy harbored, manipulations woven to drive a wedge between them. The woman who had claimed innocence in trembling tones had instead orchestrated their downfall with calculated cruelty. Eleanor's pulse thundered, not with pain, but with the shock of vindication. Alistair stepped closer, but not close enough to touch her. "I did not know," he murmured, and the fragility in his voice pierced her more sharply than any accusation. She kept her gaze fixed on the letter, unwilling to let him see the storm in her eyes. Anger, relief, sorrow, and an unfamiliar stirring of hope collided within her, each demanding to be heard. She had dreamed of this moment, proof of her innocence, but she had not anticipated the heaviness of it. Vindication did not restore the years she had lost. It did not erase the nights she had wept alone. But as she lowered the letter, she felt Alistair's gaze settle on her with a vulnerability she had never witnessed before. "Eleanor," he said softly, her name trembling on his tongue as though he feared it might shatter between them. She looked up, meeting his eyes fully for the first time since returning. In them she saw regret, deep, aching, sincere, and something else, a silent plea for the chance to make amends. The conflict that had divided them no longer rested in hidden accusations, but in the choice before her. And as the room seemed to tighten around them, Eleanor realized the next words she spoke could alter everything that came after. She drew a breath, aware the moment demanded courage,